Before Israel ever had a king, there was one man chosen by God to lead, a prophet whose prayers shook nations. This is the story of Samuel. He anointed the first kings of Israel, confronted their sins and heard the very voice of God as a boy. Samuel's journey is unlike any other. From miraculous birth to guiding a nation, Samuel's life was a bridge between judges and kings. But his calling came with a heavy cost. If you love the stories of Jesus and the Bible and want to uncover the history behind God's chosen people, subscribe to the Bible Stories today. Samuel's story begins with a barren woman named Hannah, who prayed desperately for a child. She vowed that if God granted her a son, she would dedicate him to the Lord's service forever. God answered Hannah's prayer and Samuel was born. True to her vow, Hannah brought him to Eli the high priest at Shiloh when he was still a young boy. God answered Hannah's prayer and Samuel was born. True to her vow, Hannah brought him to Eli the high priest at Shiloh when he was still a young boy. One night while Samuel was sleeping in the temple near the Ark of the Covenant, he heard a voice calling his name. At first he thought it was Eli, but it was the voice of God himself. God revealed to Samuel that Eli's household would face judgment for their corruption. Though it was a heavy message, Samuel faithfully delivered it to the old priest. From that day forward, all of Israel recognized Samuel as a prophet. His words never failed and the people saw that the Lord was truly with him. Years passed and Israel faced constant threats from the Philistines. Under Samuel's leadership, the people turned back to God, repenting of their sins and destroying their idols. When the Philistines attacked, Samuel prayed, and God sent a mighty thunderstorm that confused the enemy, giving Israel a miraculous victory. Samuel set up a large stone, naming it Ebenezer, meaning, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." It stood as a permanent reminder of God's deliverance. As Samuel grew older, he appointed his sons as judges, but they were corrupt, taking bribes and perverting justice, causing unrest among the people. The elders of Israel demanded a king to rule over them, just like other nations. Samuel was deeply troubled, but God told him, "It is not you they have rejected, but me as their king." Samuel warned the people what having a king would mean: heavy taxes, military drafts, and a ruler who would take the best of their lands and servants. But the people refused to listen. They wanted to be like other nations no matter the cost. God directed Samuel to a humble man from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul, son of Kish. Tall and strong, Saul looked like the perfect leader. Samuel privately anointed him with oil, declaring that the Lord had chosen him as king. At first, Saul was hesitant and hid from the public announcement. But when the Spirit of God came upon him, he led Israel to a decisive victory against the Ammonites, and the nation rejoiced under its new king. Samuel reminded the people to remain faithful to God, warning that if they or their king turned away, God's hand would be against them. It was a moment of both celebration and solemn responsibility. Over time, Saul's pride began to grow. When he disobeyed God's command during a battle with the Amalekites, Samuel delivered a crushing message: "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." God sent Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint the next king. In the house of Jesse, Samuel looked at 7 strong sons, but God chose none of them. Then the youngest, David, a shepherd boy, was brought in, and the Lord said, "This is the one." David was anointed in secret, for Saul still reigned. From that day the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, while Saul's heart grew restless and troubled. When the Philistine giant Goliath challenged Israel, David stepped forward in faith. Samuel's earlier words about God choosing the humble were being fulfilled before the eyes of the nation. After David's victory over Goliath, his fame spread quickly. This stirred jealousy in Saul, who began to see David not as an ally, but as a threat to his throne. Samuel, now an old man, saw the dangerous path Saul had taken. His visits to the king grew fewer, yet his prayers for Israel remained constant. The nation was caught between a declining king and a rising young warrior. Despite his age, Samuel remained a figure of authority and respect. His very presence was a reminder to the people of God's covenant, and his words still carried divine weight in Israel's decisions. Saul's jealousy drove him to hunt David, forcing the young shepherd into hiding. Samuel knew this conflict would end with the fulfillment of God's plan, but the road ahead would be dangerous and bloody. In his final public act, Samuel rebuked Saul one last time for consulting forbidden spirits instead of seeking the Lord. It was a sign of how far the king had fallen from God's path. After years of faithful service, Samuel passed away, and all Israel gathered to mourn him. They buried him in his hometown of Ramah, honoring him as one of the greatest leaders in their history. Even in death, Samuel's influence lived on. His life bridged the age of the judges and the reign of kings, reminding Israel that true leadership comes from obedience to God, not human power. After Samuel's death, Israel's spiritual foundation felt shaken. Without his prophetic guidance, the people looked more to kings than to God, a dangerous shift that Samuel had long warned against. David, though still hunted by Saul, held to the lessons Samuel had taught him, to honor the Lord above all. Twice, David spared Saul's life, proving that he would wait for God's timing to take the throne. Meanwhile, Saul grew increasingly desperate. Without Samuel's counsel, he made reckless decisions in battle, and his heart turned further away from the Lord. On the eve of a great battle against the Philistines, Saul sought the help of a forbidden medium to summon Samuel's spirit, an act of defiance against God's law. Even in death, Samuel spoke with authority. He told Saul that the Lord had departed from him, and that both he and his sons would die in the coming battle. The prophecy came true. In the battle at Mount Gilboa, Saul and his sons fell and Israel's army scattered. David's path to the throne was now clear, just as Samuel had foretold years before. David mourned Saul and Jonathan not as enemies, but as God's anointed and a beloved friend. His grief reflected Samuel's own love for Israel, a love rooted in covenant loyalty. As David became king, Samuel's legacy lived on in the way David sought God's will before battle, honored the Ark of the Covenant, and upheld the worship of the Lord. Samuel's life had set a pattern for Israel's leaders, to listen to God's voice above political pressure. Those who followed this path found blessing, those who didn't faced ruin. Generations later, the people still spoke of Samuel as a man who heard God's voice clearly. His story was told to children not as a legend, but as a reminder that God raises leaders for his purposes. Long before Samuel's name was known, there was a woman whose faith shook the heavens. Hannah was barren, mocked by her rival and heartbroken year after year. Yet she carried her sorrow not to men but to the Lord. At the Tabernacle in Shiloh, she wept so bitterly that Eli the priest thought she was drunk. But Hannah explained her anguish and her vow. "If you give me a son, I will give him to you for all the days of his life." God heard her prayer. She conceived and bore a son, naming him Samuel, meaning, God has heard. When the child was weaned, Hannah did what few mothers could. She brought her little boy to Eli, leaving him to serve in God's house. This moment was more than a mother's sacrifice. It was the beginning of a prophet's calling, one that would shape Israel's destiny forever. Samuel grew up in the sacred courts of the Tabernacle, surrounded by the rituals of Israel's worship. One night, as the lamp of God still burned, Samuel heard his name called. Thinking it was Eli, he ran to the priest. But Eli had not called him. This happened 3 times before Eli realized it was the Lord. Eli told him, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That night, God revealed his judgment against Eli's household because of their corruption. Samuel awoke with a heavy burden, but when morning came, he delivered the message faithfully. This was the moment Samuel became not just a servant in God's house, but a prophet, one who would hear God's voice for the rest of his life. Years passed, and Samuel became Israel's judge, leading the people in both spiritual and national matters. Under his guidance, the nation repented of its idolatry and turned back to the Lord. When the Philistines attacked, Samuel prayed, and God sent a mighty thunder that threw the enemy into confusion, granting Israel victory. To commemorate this, Samuel set up a large stone and named it Ebenezer. Thus far the Lord has helped us. Unlike other leaders, Samuel combined the roles of prophet, priest, and judge, guiding the nation with integrity. Yet he always knew that Israel's true king was the Lord himself, and he lived to keep the people under that divine rule. Years passed, and Samuel became Israel's judge, leading the people in both spiritual and national matters. Under his guidance, the nation repented of its idolatry and turned back to the Lord. When the Philistines attacked, Samuel prayed, And God sent a mighty thunder that threw the enemy into confusion, granting Israel victory. To commemorate this, Samuel set up a large stone and named it Ebenezer. Thus far the Lord has helped us. Unlike other leaders, Samuel combined the roles of prophet, priest and judge, guiding the nation with integrity. Yet he always knew that Israel's true king was the Lord himself, and he lived to keep the people under that divine rule. God led Samuel to Saul, a tall and impressive man from the tribe of Benjamin. In a private moment, Samuel poured oil from a ram's horn over Saul's head, declaring him chosen by the Lord. At first, Saul seemed humble, even hiding among the supplies when it was time to be presented to the people. But when the Spirit of God came upon him, Saul led Israel to victory against the Ammonites. The nation rejoiced, and Samuel reminded them to remain faithful to God under this new monarchy. It was a turning point. Israel now had a king, but Samuel remained the spiritual compass of the nation. It did not take long for Saul's flaws to emerge. In one battle he offered sacrifices himself instead of waiting for Samuel, showing impatience and disregard for God's instructions. Later God commanded Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, but Saul spared their king and the best livestock. When Samuel confronted him, Saul insisted he had obeyed. Samuel's famous reply still echoes today: "To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams." Then Samuel delivered the crushing verdict: "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul grabbed his robe, tearing it. Samuel said, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today." God sent Samuel to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse. One by one Jesse's older sons passed before him, each strong and impressive. But God told Samuel, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Finally, the youngest son, David, was brought in from tending sheep. God said, "This is the one." Samuel anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. It was a quiet but world-changing moment. As David's fame grew, Saul's jealousy consumed him. Samuel, now an old man, withdrew from public life but continued to pray for the nation. He watched from a distance as the tension between Saul and David escalated. Eventually, Samuel passed away and all Israel mourned. His death left a spiritual void, for he had been the last of the judges, a prophet whose words never fell to the ground. But even in death his influence lingered, shaping the nation's destiny through the leaders he had anointed. In desperation before a battle with the Philistines, Saul sought out a forbidden medium at Endor to call up Samuel's spirit. When Samuel appeared, even the medium screamed in fear. Saul begged for guidance, but Samuel's message was grim: "The Lord has turned away from you. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." It was a chilling prophecy of doom, and it came true. In the battle at Mount Gilboa, Saul and his sons fell. The era Samuel had ushered in ended in tragedy, but the way was now clear for David, the king God had chosen. Samuel's life bridged two eras, the time of the judges and the reign of kings. He showed Israel that leadership is not about power or appearance, but about hearing and obeying God. His courage to speak truth to kings, his faith to pray for victory, and his humility to step aside when God raised another leader, all made him one of the greatest figures in Israel's history. To this day, Samuel's story calls us to live with integrity and to place God's will above our own ambitions. Samuel's story is not just history, it is a blueprint for living faithfully in any generation. His life teaches us that God calls people from unexpected places, that prayer changes nations, and that integrity matters more than public approval. We see in Samuel the importance of listening for God's voice, even when it speaks uncomfortable truths. We see the need for courage when confronting sin, and humility when passing leadership to the next generation. These are not just ancient principles, they are truths for every believer today. Israel's demand for a human king, despite Samuel's warnings, was a turning point in their history. It was a rejection of God's direct rule, a choice that led to both great triumphs and devastating failures. This choice reflects a timeless human struggle, the desire to control our own destiny rather than submit to God's plan. Samuel's warnings echo through history. The leaders we choose will shape the character of our nations for better or for worse. One of the most powerful aspects of Samuel's life was his prayer. From his mother's dedication to his final days, prayer was at the center of his ministry. He interceded for Israel in battle, sought God's will in leadership, and mourned over the nation's sins. Samuel shows us that prayer is not passive. It moves the hand of God and shapes the course of history. Even kings needed his prayers more than his presence, because Samuel knew that God alone was Israel's true strength. Samuel never softened God's message to make it easier to hear. Whether confronting Eli about his corrupt sons, warning Israel about the dangers of monarchy, or rebuking King Saul for disobedience, Samuel spoke truth without fear. In a world where leaders often tell people what they want to hear, Samuel reminds us that real love speaks the truth, even when it costs us dearly. Though their time together was short, Samuel left a deep mark on David. He taught him that kingship was service, not privilege. He modeled what it meant to seek God's will in every decision. David carried these lessons into his reign, and though he stumbled, he always returned to God's ways, a reflection of the spiritual foundation Samuel had helped lay. From his miraculous birth to his death as one of Israel's most honored prophets, Samuel's life was a testimony to the power of obedience, faith, and courage. He stood between eras, guiding Israel from tribal judges to a united monarchy, all while keeping God's voice at the center. His story challenges us today. Will we listen for God's call? Will we obey even when it costs us? And will we leave behind a legacy that points others to Him? Like Samuel, we may never see the full impact of our obedience in our lifetime, but God's purposes will unfold through it for generations to come.